Okay, I'd like to welcome our YouTube audience out there back to actually the first in our series of lectures in our Unsilencing the Archives YouTube Zoom series. But before we get to today's lecture, I would like to hand the floor over to our curator, Melissa Craddock, who will read a land statement.
Thank you, Aaron. We would like to begin by acknowledging that Berkeley, California is on the territory of the Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone. We respect the land and the people who have stewarded it throughout many generations, and we honor their elders, both past and present. We're living in a moment that warrants deep reflection on our past, wherein even our most venerated figures deserve reasonable scrutiny. During his time directing the archaeological excavations of Tel Nasbe, W.F. Bade participated in harmful stereotyping of Palestinian Arabs that was common among white Americans and Europeans conducting fieldwork in British Mandate Palestine. Some of these attitudes appear in print in his popular 1934 book, A Manual of Excavation in the Near East. Museums are also scrutinizing their collections, including evaluating the legal status and the ethics with which they were acquired. As stewards of the legacy of the Bade Museum and its holdings, it's our responsibility to faithfully evaluate the process by which the collections were acquired within the context of our contemporary moment. One approach is to ask new questions of the archival materials in order to examine critically the manner and impact of archaeological work on Indigenous communities and to investigate the colonial conditions in which it played a part. The Bade Museum recognizes that its location and collection are part of ongoing and painful colonial legacies that contributed to historical inequalities. These legacies have directly and indirectly impacted populations locally and abroad in Palestine, where excavations were conducted under the authority of the British Mandate government of Palestine. In an effort to bring light to these issues, to serve a broad public audience online, and to connect to the local community that it serves, the museum is taking action to become a more inclusive, welcoming, and equitable institution that practices the philosophy of radical inclusion adopted by its parent institution, Pacific School of Religion. One of these steps is the creation of open access web exhibitions and public programming like this lecture series, which highlight decolonizing themes. We invite you to participate in these programs so that together we can listen, learn, and work toward creating a more inclusive museum community. Thank you for joining us today.
And Felicity, now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Melissa. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to just make a similar statement on behalf of the Palestine Exploration Fund, who I represent, and who are one of the sponsors of the exhibition that Melissa and Sam put together. The PEF fully endorses the Bade Museum's statement on decolonization and supports their efforts in this regard. As a funding organisation, we were very pleased to support the Bade Museum's project to create an online exhibition to highlight the lives and work of the Arab workforce at the Tel Nasbe excavations, and these online lectures exploring the contribution of the local population to the archaeology of Palestine. As another Western colonial era organisation, our own history shares many of the same characteristics which have just been described, and we are keen to play our part in this process, both as co-hosts of these lectures and with our own initiatives. And so now it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Sarah Irving, who is a lecturer in modern Middle Eastern history and a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at Staffordshire University in Britain, and editor of Contemporary Levant, a journal for the Council of British Research in the Levant. She is a social and cultural historian, primarily of late Ottoman and Mandate Palestine, and often uses the records of archaeological excavations to explore the lives of ordinary Palestinians, including working class women and men in this period. So without further ado, over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Felicity, and thank you to everybody involved in this series for inviting me to speak. It's a great honour, really. It was also really lovely to see the acknowledgement of land at the beginning of something like this. It's something that I'm very familiar with from the Australian context. I'm married to an Australian, but I've not come across it in the North American context before. So that was something that was really lovely to see starting this off. Can somebody who's not silenced just confirm that my presentation is showing up okay there?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, why aren't you showing? Now?
Yes, if you advance the slide, I think it's in that weird. There we go. Perfect. I know.
There we go. Brilliant. Okay. So yes, thank you very much to everybody watching. I'm assuming there's someone watching out there. And good afternoon from where I am in Britain. So I'm going to be speaking on the title of my talk is Guarding Archaeology, Everyday Labour, and I managed to sneak in a British spelling there, in the British Mandate Department of Antiquities. And I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about archives themselves, because it's kind of a key question in what I'm doing here, and obviously is something that's very much evoked by the sort of origins of this talk, with Melissa and Sam's online exhibition, which, if you haven't already seen it, is amazing and very much worth going and spending a bit of time on, and also watching the launch event that they did. So the principal archive that I used to prepare this talk, and some of the other work that I do, which looks at the ordinary working class peasant, and I very much believe in reclaiming the word peasant in terms of rural labour, despite the fact that it kind of has taken on at least some negative connotations, but kind of trying to find out as much as is possible about ordinary Palestinian life, and the fact that there is this sort of slightly unusual situation whereby the records of archaeological activities, be they excavations or sort of wider antiquities preservation, actually are a really, really valuable source for this broader question of what life was like for ordinary Palestinian people, principally under the rule of the British Mandate, so between World War I and 1948. So in terms of British colonial archives from during that period, when the British realized that they had really fouled things up in Palestine over the previous 30 years and withdrew in 1947-48, they took quite a lot of the archives back with them. Some of the most controversial were very possibly destroyed. The majority perhaps are now in the National Archives in South London, but quite a lot, for various reasons, were left behind. And the archaeological archives for quite a significant part of that. And that is because the Department of Antiquities of the British Mandate Administration was based in the Palestine Archaeological Museum. In 1948, when Palestine was partitioned, the Palestine Archaeological Museum fell under Jordanian rule, and all of the Department of Antiquities archives, their ongoing administrative paperwork was still in the museum. So it's under Jordanian ownership until 1967, with the Six-Day War and the Israeli occupation of East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and of course Gaza and the Jowlan as well. And that means that when the Israelis take over the Palestine Archaeological Museum, it is renamed as the Rockefeller Museum, as it still is, all of these archives end up in the possession of the Israeli Antiquities Authority, where there has been a kind of ongoing digitization process. For anybody watching who is interested, whether in the archaeological side of things or in Palestinian social history, this, I think, is a little bit of an untapped archive, possibly because it's fairly horrible to use. The digitization is in JPEGs. It's not text searchable. The setup of the website is very, very odd. And things are pretty much impossible to find by searching. So you literally just have to wade through and find things. And of course, there's all sorts of bigger questions of colonialism and coloniality when we're using an archive like this. There's a kind of double coloniality here. Of course, this is British colonial material, and then it's been put up and digitized by the Israeli state. And of course, there's the whole sort of question of what that means in terms of Palestine. But I hope that what I am using these for in some ways is a kind of attempt to not just kind of read against the grain, but to find ways in which to use this archive to ask questions that are maybe quite different from maybe the sort of things that might have been intended by the people creating them. And one of the types of file that are particularly interesting, I think, and give us some particularly unique insights are that, quite unusually, I suspect most of the sort of ordinary bog standard HR personnel files of the British Mandate will have been destroyed as not being of interest, not being relevant. But because this stuff was, it seems, preserved fairly willy-nilly, there are what we would now call HR files still amongst them. And this is a picture from the archive website of the folders that they hold for the site of Atlit, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. And as you can see, as well as all of the sort of fairly standard archaeological subjects that are going along here, so the cemetery, the castle, conservation, various related things like that, we have these names that appear, and these are local workers who were employed on the site at Atlit or in the area. And these give, in some cases, what I would say are possibly unique insights into the lives of ordinary Palestinians who are working for the Mandate authorities. So there is an increasing awareness, I think, in the literature of middle-class, educated Palestinians who worked for the Mandate, and the kind of ideas and agency and political involvement and social and cultural kind of aspects of their lives. But it's, I guess, famously difficult to ask similar questions about working class people, people who are often non-literate or partly literate, who very, very, very rarely have written their life stories, their ideas, and are rarely interviewed about their histories, their biographies. Obviously, there are elements that are problematic about these records. Pretty much everything is mediated through translators in a lot of cases. By the look of the archives, there are quite a lot of documents where there will have been an Arabic original which has been just binned, but the translation that was done for non-Arabic reading members of the Mandate staff has been retained. So there's mediation through translation. If we assume, as seems to be the case with the person I'm going to be talking about, that most of these manual workers were mainly non-literate, then there's probably a scribe or somebody else who is writing the letters that they send to head office, and again, are mediating what they say. But I think there are still valid methodological kind of question, kind of ways that we can still ask some pertinent questions of this archival material. So who were these working class labourers in the Palestinian Department of Antiquities under the Mandate? They cover a whole range of job roles. There's manual labourers, there are guards on archaeological sites, There's museum attendants, there's delivery staff. So there's an entire folder on bicycles for delivery staff. There are night watchmen at the museum and on site. There are caretakers, janitors, people who are doing various kind of sort of managerial to manual jobs, mending things, building things. Some of these sound very routine. They probably were. They may well have been quite boring for some people. They, in a lot of cases, were potentially quite risky. If you read even the published accounts of a lot of early excavations in Palestine and elsewhere, there are quite often accidents. The picture that I've got up here is one that I took at the Palestine Exploration Fund a couple of weeks ago of the dig in Jerusalem in 1927, where because of an earthquake, which is kind of the main focus of my research at the moment, a worker was actually trapped. And you picked this picture because it kind of you can see how far down they're digging and that there's no sort of wooden struts or anything being put in place. So it's quite risky stuff going on for the excavators. There was also the possibility for those who are guarding sites to feel threatened. So we see a number of cases in the archive where there are people requesting to be allocated firearms, for instance. There was a site guard at Khurbat al-Mafjar, so better known as Hisham's Palace in Jericho, saying from the night watchman, who was saying that he wanted a firearm because there were hyenas around and he could hear them prowling, and he was afraid. And even for museum attendants, they had right of arrest if people tried to steal or otherwise interfere with the things in the museum. So obviously they are at least expected to put themselves into positions of confrontation. So, you know, these are not necessarily easy jobs. Some of them are permanent, as you'll see. Others, especially obviously working on excavations themselves, were seasonal. So there's the question of what work it is that people are doing outside of those seasons. So, you know, these are hard, occasionally dangerous, and sometimes insecure and not terribly well paid roles in society. But they were also, as we'll come to see, quite sought after. So I'm going to particularly be talking about a site on the coast of what is now Israel, called Athlete. It's sometimes spelled athlete, sometimes athlete, depends partly of whether you're transcribing from Arabic or Hebrew. It's mainly and best known for being a Crusader site with some Islamic finds as well. But in the area, there are also some really important prehistoric sites, for instance, and lots of other kind of, I mean, this is Palestine and Israel we're talking about. You can't stick a fork in the ground without hitting something archaeological. And it was excavated or partially excavated by the Mandate Department of Antiquities field archaeologist Cedric Johns in the early and mid 1930s. It fell at the time in a region covered by the Antiquities inspector for the sort of northern part of Mandate Palestine. And this is a man called Naim Shahadi Mahuli, who was a Christian Palestinian from Kufr Yassif, which is a bit further north. At this point in time, he is based in Akka, St. John of Acre, so a bit north of Athlete. And he is what we would nowadays call the line manager to the man that I'm mainly going to be speaking about, Abdullah al-Masri. And John's, Mahuli, and anybody else in this area who's working for the Mandate authorities ultimately reports to the Jerusalem office. This is where the Mandate authorities have their offices, and where the headquarters of the Department of Antiquities is placed. Now, I just want to point out before I leave this slide, fabulous picture of this Crusader building at Athlete. I've got lots of Crusader pictures and lovely pictures from Athlete, which hopefully will make Aaron happy. But down in the bottom left-hand corner, you might be able to see in the archway where there's daylight coming through, there's a figure of a man. And we don't know what Abdullah al-Masri, the guy that I'm going to be talking about mainly, looked like. There's absolutely no known photos of him, but this might be the sort of thing that you possibly want to imagine. This photo was taken at about the time that he was working there. It may well be that he was the guy who was showing this photographer who came from the American colony in Jerusalem, the Matson collection. He may well have been him that was showing the photographer around. So it may well be that this is Abdullah that we're looking at in this corner, but we don't actually know. But it does give you a sense of the sort of person that you might want to have in your head while I'm talking about his career. In terms of the sort of working conditions of somebody working as a guard at the site of Athlete. So it's got a big archaeological site. There's the castle. There's various other remains. There's a graveyard there. Some of it's been dug. Some of it hasn't. There are increasing numbers of visitors there during the 1930s, which is the period that I'll be talking about. It's somewhere where tourists to Palestine come and see, because it's this big castle that's very, very prominent as you travel up the coast, so just south of Haifa, or down the coast if you've sailed into Haifa. And also educated Palestinians, Jewish residents of Palestine, and colonial officials and things like that might well come to somewhere like this at the weekend. It's quite a popular sort of tourist destination for the weekend. It's got a castle, it's got nice hills, it's got a beach. Why not? It's a nice place to go. And Abdullah, the guy I'm talking about, he sometimes is showing people around. There are also, however, squatters living partly in the castle at times. It takes the Mandate government quite a long time to negotiate them actually leaving, and they are paid compensation. That's a whole other question, but it's worth bearing in mind that there is an issue here over who actually kind of has daily ownership and daily sort of run of the place. And it's in an area that is changing rapidly. It's on the coastal plain, as I said, just south of Haifa. Haifa at this point in time is a rapidly expanding major city, port, industrial zone. And at Athlete itself, there are quarries. There is the Palestine Salt Company works, which is a growing kind of industrial concern. There's a British military camp, which starts to be used as a prisoner camp further into the 1930s. So there's a lot going on around this place. I think quite often we maybe sort of envisage things like a castle on the sea in Palestine as being something that is a bit sort of cut off from the sort of wider economic, political and social currents that surround it. But actually Athlete Castle is very much stuck right in the middle of them. And Abdullah al-Masri himself. So Abdullah originally worked for C.N. Johns on the excavations that I was talking about at Athlete. He was presumably undertaking some kind of manual labor there, but he also learnt to do a very good job of reassembling ceramics. We know this much from the archives. He then seems, when the excavations aren't going on, to have been hired as a guard during John's absence. It seems that although, as you can see from this photo, there was a campsite in the earlier days of the excavation, it seems that there was a house of some kind which the British either built or acquired, rented or bought or something. And Masri's job was partly to guard that and also to keep an eye on the tools that were stored in it from the excavations, and also there were finds held there still. that hadn't been taken away from the site. It may well be that the Mandate authorities were perhaps planning a small museum there. They did actually try to open up quite a lot of small archaeological museums. There's the ones that we know about that sort of still exist and have been written about, particularly in Jerusalem, but there were kind of failed attempts as well that we know about, one in Nablus, one in Akka. As a guard, Abdullah was expected to be on site night and day. So this is a big responsibility. He's supposed to be there 24 hours a day, even though his family live in Tantura, which is a Palestinian village about 5 or 6 miles south of Atlit. So doesn't sound far. Actually, that's a 2-hour walk. So he's guarding the British dig house and the ruins. He's expected to keep the ruins safe, to make sure people don't start digging for finds to sell, to make sure it's not damaged, and presumably, although it's never made explicit, that he might have had to have some kind of relationship with the squatters as well. He performs daily upkeep, he weeds, he mends bits of the building that are potentially going to be damaged or falling down or something like this. He keeps the graves clear on the cemetery. He's maintaining the place on a daily basis. He is allowed to leave the site on Friday afternoons in order to go down to Tantura and see his family, but that's the only sort of official weekly time that he gets off. And he's also expected to be there to receive and guide visitors. So this suggests that he has at least a bit of English or French in order to be able to communicate with them. And he starts this job as the site guard, according to his HR records, in December 1930. The first 5 or so years of his records are reasonably quiet. He gets on with things. He asks for pay rises occasionally. Sometimes they're granted. He seems to have a growing family, of which C.N. Johns is obviously aware. So he obviously knows something a little bit about his life. So he's got a growing number of children with his wife, who are living with his wife in Tantura. He's sick at one point. He gets a fever and is in hospital for a couple of weeks. But basically, if his HR records are anything to go by, things kind of trot along reasonably okay for the first 5 years or so. But as I mentioned, there is a lot of change going on in the area. There is a rapidly increasing Jewish population. So there are tensions that are rising between Jewish citizens of Palestine and Arabs. And in 1963 is kind of one of the first of the sort of pivot moments that goes on here. There's no sign before that Abdullah is dissatisfied with his working conditions or anything like this. But something kind of is obviously kind of cracks a little bit. And up to this point, he seems to have had a particularly good relationship with C.N. Johns. Obviously, he knows him personally. They've worked together on the excavation. And Johns seems to be more sympathetic than many of the other Mandate sort of senior staff. He's reasonably empathetic to questions of things like having a growing family and the costs attached to that, to the fact that there is quite serious inflation in Palestine at this point in time. So Abdullah's pay packet is going to be worth less and less. And this sometimes really does kind of contrast with the department directors, so people like Ernest Richmond and Hamilton after him, who sometimes seem quite suspicious in a very sort of Orientalist kind of way, assuming that Arabs are maybe by definition a bit lazy or a bit deceitful in their working practices. There are also tensions between Abdullah and Naim Mahuli, the regional inspector. This might have partly been that because of their personal acquaintance, Abdullah has a tendency to try and communicate with the head office through C.N. Johns and to write to Jerusalem directly, which he's not supposed to do. Naim Mahuli is his line manager. He's supposed to try and communicate through him, but it's not always easy for him to get hold of Naim. especially once Mahuli moves to Nazareth, which is a lot further away. And so this is one of the sort of things that turns in a little bit tense just within the internal working relationships here. But in terms of the sort of general conditions, the pay isn't fantastic, although it's comparable to other sort of manual roles, like sort of service jobs and things like this, where in cases where we can see what people are being paid in Palestine at this point. But he does get some sick pay. He does get paid holidays. He gets the equivalent of about 2 or 3 weeks of paid holidays per year. Some of those are allocated on religious holidays. So mandate staff would choose whether they took Christian or Muslim or Jewish religious holidays as paid. But also there is a personal holiday allowance. And when he has a personal holiday, he can also get things like free rail tickets for himself and his family in order to travel. So, you know, this is not a terrible job, especially given that we are talking about a period of quite significant unemployment during quite a lot of 1930s in Palestine. But as I mentioned, there are rising tensions in the area of Atlit itself. And this is partly the general situation in Palestine during the 1930s, due to kind of various aspects of British mandate policy, the fact that you have rising political tension between Palestinian Muslims and Christians and Jewish immigrants. But there are also things that are quite specific to Atlit as a site. And especially after the beginning of the Palestinian uprising in 1936, I think Abdullah would have been finding himself in an increasingly just unpleasant place to be working for the mandate authorities on his own a lot of the time, and in a place where people are tense. So the British have a military camp at Atlit, which at some point in the 1930s starts being used as a prison camp. Now, I've not been able to work out exactly when that is. Most of the literature says 1938 or 9, because that's when it starts being used to imprison Jewish people who are coming to Palestine, especially to flee Nazi Germany. This, of course, is the point in time when places like Britain and the United States start stopping Jews from coming in. So if you're trying to flee Nazi Germany, it becomes harder and harder. So the British open this big prison camp. But before it's used for Jewish immigrants, it is used for rebels in the 1936-39 uprising. So it's a dangerous place to be around. In 1937, there'd been a big raid by around 200 rebels trying to free some of their comrades from the camp. On another occasion, Abdullah is actually kidnapped for 24 hours by some rebels who steal the official issue gun that he has for his job from him. They actually take him from his home, blindfold him, take him away, and then release him. On another occasion, he's asked to stand guarantee for a cousin of his who'd been a rebel and given himself up. And Abdullah asks his bosses in the Department of Antiquities to say that he can't do this because of what his job is, and that he shouldn't be asked to do this. He obviously wants to very much disentangle himself from a kind of official trouble. Trouble hits him again in 1938 there's a circumstance where a Palestinian policeman, a man called Mustafa Khoury, is shot dead by a Jewish member of the Palestine police force, who is the guy in this photograph. His name is Mordechai Schwartz, and he was a Czech Jew who had come to Palestine, joined the Palestine police, and then was allegedly so angry about some previous incidents during the rebellion that he had shot his colleague who he was sharing a tent with overnight. And Abdullah is actually one of the witnesses who is called for this trial. And again, he asks his bosses to try and get him out of this. And reading between the lines of some of the letters that he sends about this, he's very much aware of a kind of sort of positionality that he has, in terms of he knows that he is legally being asked to come and testify in court. And he wants his bosses to say that he can't. So there's a kind of interesting thing going on where he is sort of actively trying to take on this sort of even more subservient position in order to get out of an entanglement like this. But what seems to be happening in his HR reports, in the letters that he is sending, in the discussions about him, in Naim Mahuli's letters back to Jerusalem, is that Abdullah is quite obviously getting more and more dissatisfied with his working conditions. He doesn't want to be there. He starts asking to be transferred to Jerusalem, and he starts having time off for back trouble. There's various terminology that's used in the doctor's reports for it. But I suspect that if this was a modern day personnel situation, people would be starting to ask questions about, whether this is stress and stuff like this going on. And he also starts being increasingly commonly found absent from work. Mahuli or someone else will go to the site and he won't be there. He will be down in Tantura, usually with his family. And he starts getting in more and more trouble for this. He has holiday docked, he has pay docked. So as well as the sort of wider tensions that are happening in the politics of the area, this is very much kind of overlapping, and I think probably has a causative relationship with Abdullah's everyday relations at work. And this kind of really sort of the situation deteriorates completely in the winter and spring of 1940-41. There are some particularly serious allegations of absence. They're probably not true, it seems, in the papers, but certainly people get quite angry and inquiries are made. Abdullah asks more often for transfer to Jerusalem, or he asks to have an extra night when he can be at home. He suggests that one of his colleagues can cover for him. His colleague says, well, no, because that means that I have to work the extra night and my family are left alone more often. And there are increasingly angry letters happening in all sorts of different directions. Abdullah is finally given his notice in March of 1941, but it's really not a clean break. It's difficult to say when he actually stops guarding the site. It might be as late as August that year. It's a little bit hard to tell, but there are various applicants for the job. As I mentioned, it's actually seen as quite a desirable position. So there's various applicants for the job who emerge, and I'll speak about them in a minute. Abdullah also apparently hopes to be reinstated. His initial responses to being fired are very much kind of declarations of innocence, a slightly sort of a kind of martyred sort of aggrieved kind of you don't want me, so I'll just go now kind of sense to things. But then later on, when I think he's hoping that the British will just kind of back down and say, oh, it's okay, we'll just dock a bit of pay or something again. But he does seem to be hoping that he's going to be reinstated. When he isn't, he comes out very directly and says, please give me my job back. I'll take a pay cut. I'll do whatever you want. And they turn around and say, I'm sorry, we've got somebody else. We could maybe give you some excavation work. And he points out that he can't do manual work because of his bad back that we already know about. And by this point, so he's born probably in about 1900, he is 40, and he's lived quite a hard life, and he doesn't perceive himself as being able to do manual work. He also has a strong sense of grievance. He sees himself as having a right to a job. He's given, as he perceives it, and I think justifiably so, he's given 10 years of his life to this job. He's worked hard. He's gone well beyond the sort of requirements of the job of just sort of sitting there and guarding the place. He's mended stuff. He's talked to visitors and things. This has been taken into account in his pay rises, and he was being paid quite a lot more than similar guards, for instance, at Khabat al-Mafja. But he's also being paid less than similar guards in urban sites. So he's kind of in a bit of an in-between position in terms of his sort of take-home pay, but he does perceive himself as having quite a clear kind of moral right to keep this job, and is very annoyed when he is told, no, I'm sorry, somebody else has been given it, you can't come back. And then there is this sort of question of how to replace him. And ultimately, he is replaced by Atta Milhelm, who had been guarding one of the prehistoric sites in the hills, just sort of slightly inland from Atlit. And this is quite a significant sort of raise in status for Atta, but the department also takes the opportunity to cut their costs, and they actually pay him £1 a month less, so 20% less than they are paying Abdullah. But there is also quite a lot of processes that go on in terms of actually finding a new member of staff to take on Abdullah's role. The local villagers show, and there is a series of sort of letters and petitions, and this is one, and you can see quite a lot of them, that some of them have signed their own names and others have signed with a thumbprint or a stamp. But there's a very clear sense that the local villagers feel that they should have a voice in who this job is given to. This is somebody who's going to be living amongst them, who's going to be around their families. And they actively reject some candidates. They say, no, we know about this guy, he's bad, he's got a prison record, we don't want him here, we don't care if he's married to a local woman, we're not having him. Oh, what about this guy? And there are also a series of letters that come from people like the manager of the salt factory, which was a Jewish agency, a Zionist organization enterprise that had been there since the early 1920s. And it sort of shows the entanglement of the villages and these big enterprises that in conventional narratives about Mandate Palestine are often depicted as being very separate from ordinary working class Arab Palestinian life. But they're used for references and backing up claims and things like this. So there's a real sense that this is a desirable job, and it's also a job that's seen as embedded in the community. The archaeological site is not separate. It is part of how the villagers see their local area, and they want to determine who actually gets the role. And this is possibly one of the reasons that Atta Milhelm is given the job. They know him, he's from not far away. He's a known quantity. So just to sum up what I hope has maybe come across in this talk, the fact that archaeological paperwork, even some of the most sort of mundane and routine archival material, can, I think, be seen as really quite valuable as a social history source. It covers a whole range of workers, their experiences, their relationships with their seniors, the nature of the labour itself, the labour relations, the colonial authority that's going on here. I think it highlights the entanglement of archaeology with its local social, economic, political environments, what's going on around an archaeological site like this. And I think also it's kind of important to consider even somebody as sort of usually perceived as lowly and sort of unskilled as Abdullah al-Masri as having his place in the archaeological site here, in terms of how that visitors see it, what they're told about it, what they look at, what they maybe don't bother looking at. And those villagers, of course, are British and Arab and Jewish. So there's impacts there, as well as the fact that, and I have no idea how good his skills as a renovator of Crusader sites were, but presumably there's still mortar on Atlit Castle that Abdullah al-Masri, sort of built into it. So I think, we get quite an important insight here, not only into archaeological history and archaeological labour, but more widely into questions of colonization, colonial power relations, colonial labour relations, but of the individual personalities in relations that kind of go on within those. So I hope that's been of interest. And I think now I hand back over to Felicity or Melissa.
Thank you so much for that excellent and incredibly rich talk. Felicity, did you want to chime in before I go to the Q&A? You're muted.
Always do that, sorry. Yeah, just to say thank you very much, Sarah. Really, really interesting. And I think it's particularly interesting to learn about this perceived connection between the local community and the archaeology, and that there was an awareness of that in the Mandate era. Because sometimes I think that it's seen, one of the complaints about local communities is that they're divorced from the archaeologists in some way. So it's an interesting fact, I suppose, to come out of that.
Yeah, I mean, we do tend to see it in and I think a lot of I very much remember from a lot of the Palestine Exploration Fund materials, the only time quite often that local people are talked about in a lot of the letters and the reports is either as labourers or as looters, and that's it. And there's always this allegation that, oh, well, they're just not interested. And I think even if it's just on the level of it being a useful local workplace, an place of employment for one of the, Abn al-Balad, the sons of the village, it's seen as something in which the local village has a stake and that is important to them.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to our question and answer portion of the program and invite the YouTube audience to submit questions via the YouTube chat function. So our first couple of questions are about the archives themselves. And the first question is, how do the archives that are currently under control of the State of Israel compare with the archives that were taken back to Britain in terms of the scope and the contents of those archives? And was there any kind of underlying logic or strategy to the division of the archives as there was sometimes applied to, let's say, division of artifacts?
As far as I can tell from having experience of both, what seems to have been taken back by the British is the stuff that they perceived as administratively important. So anything that's sort of policy, that's about actually running the country, all of that sort of stuff, that's taken back. The stuff that seems to be left behind, and it's split between various places. So I've talked about the stuff that's held by the Israeli Antiquities Authority. There's quite a lot at the Israeli National Archives. That's partially digitized. And then also the municipalities. I mean, one of the main places where there is continuity in the archives is that at the city level of just running a town, there are places where the archives still exist. So Nablus has quite significant archives. Jerusalem does, although apparently they are now no longer accessible to researchers. I've been told that they've been put in some storage place somewhere and nobody is allowed to look at them anymore. But yeah, basically the stuff that's been left behind, the archaeological stuff is a bit of an anomaly because that seems to be almost everything. There are Department of Antiquities files in the British National Archives, but it's mainly files that existed in London. So it's letters that came from Jerusalem to London. And antiquities files that ended up in other departments because they were being passed around. For instance, at the Treasury, at the Jerusalem Treasury or the Jerusalem Department of Works. But most of the archaeology stuff gets left behind at all levels. So there is this stuff that's kind of, talking about one guy at this one site, like the stuff I've been talking about, right up to sort of, policy stuff about antiquities and what's, the sort of actual decision-making levels. In terms of other archives that are left behind, it tends to be this kind of the stuff that basically the British didn't see as important enough to bother carrying back, and wasn't sort of controversial or confidential enough to them for them to bother burning it. So it's things like personal records like this, or it's sometimes like, really sort of low level kind of documentation from the Public Works Department about, tarmacking a road, and stuff like that.
Thank you. Another related question to that, the archives that did either make their way to London or the letters that were sent there, are they cataloged and or digitized? Are there differences in accessibility of these archives between what's in the UK and what's in the state of Israel?
Okay, so the archaeological stuff, as far as I know, has been sort of from kind of secondhand stuff that I've been told informally. It's almost the project of one individual within the authority. I'm not even sure if it's ongoing. It's quite haphazard, and it's literally just the name of the file. There is no searchability at a finer level than that. You literally just have to wade through it. The stuff that is in the Israeli National Archives is PDF'd, and there is some level of text searchability to it, but it's quite erratic. I guess probably because of the character recognition sort of software and issues with handwriting and things like that. So it can be a bit random what keyword searches will throw up in it. There have also been various issues, which I'm not going to go into in great depth because we could be here all night, to do with what the state of Israel reveals of archives and what it doesn't. There are various Israeli NGOs sort of campaigning for greater access. And then obviously there are issues kind of in terms of who can and can't go to Israel itself and access archives. And obviously there are a lot of people who are excluded from that. In Britain, as far as I know, all of the stuff that's there is in the British National Archives. So it's at Kew. It is catalogued at the level of the folder names. And there is a little bit of keyword stuff attached to those, but not very much. None of that's been digitized. And again, if you can go to London, if you can get the British Home Office to give you a visa, and all of those sorts of things. I apologise to my government if there are any people who have ever had to deal with the fundamental racisms of the British visa system. But again, a bit like Israel, it's a question of who can and can't actually go to those archives. I would also like to say that if there are people who can't get to the British archives and they want images of these, I've got an awful lot and I am willing to share digital copies. So do please get in touch with me. I've done a lot of sharing of the now probably tens of thousands of document images that I've got from British archives, and I'm willing to share them more. But no, they're not digitized. There doesn't seem to be much in the way of plans to digitize them, and certainly if you're looking for individuals, you're not going to be able to. You have to go and physically look at them. They're not kind of keyword tagged at that kind of level. It's very much just on the level of kind of antiquities, archaeology, maybe the names of a major find like the Dead Sea Scrolls, but nothing more granular than that.
Thank you. That's all incredibly useful information for the researchers and specialists who are tuning in today. So thank you.
And there are some really good articles if you kind of search on kind of Palestinian archives, Israel, and things like that. There have been several very useful kind of articles written about this stuff. And as I said, there are NGOs in Israel working on this. So it's a moving process, particularly in terms of access to the Israeli archives.
Okay, yeah, all very helpful information. So a question that I have for you is related to the web exhibit from the Bade Museum. And one aspect of that exhibit was a focus on pay, and specifically differential rates of pay based on different hierarchies, basically internal project hierarchies, as well as job duties and social hierarchies. For example, lower rates of pay for women and children compared to men, and lower rates of pay for Palestinian manual laborers as opposed to the Egyptian foremen. So in your talk today, you mentioned that the archives record things like holiday time and occasional requests for pay raises on an individual basis for workers like Abdullah al-Masri. But more broadly speaking, do the extant archives address rates of pay in a more systemic way? And if so, can you comment on the kinds of pay scales that you've seen?
Okay, this isn't something that I have looked at in a systematic kind of way across the archives, but I am very aware that the stuff is there. It's not recorded in any sort of single place. So the various places within the archives that will tell you bits of stuff about this are, so the mandate authorities have to put together something called the estimates every year, which are what they're going to spend and what they hope to get in. And there are discussions of senior pay rates in those. There are also some other kind of senior level. There's letters, pay negotiations, job adverts, things like this that tell us how much, director, the director, the deputy director, the curator of the museum, the field archaeologist, the inspectors, how much they're all on. So, I mean, the hierarchy is very, sort of fairly obviously in a colonial situation like this. The British are getting most. That's also partly because they are getting expatriation allowances on top of what the role would normally involve. You also have up to regional inspector level and a couple of other positions within the department, Palestinian, Arab and Jewish staff, so educated figures like, so there is a guy called Leo Mayer, who is a very sort of significant scholar of Islamic art, who comes in the early 1920s to Palestine with a PhD from, I think, Vienna University, and having worked at sort of the big Oriental Institute in Berlin and things. He's the librarian there for a while before he goes to the Hebrew University as a lecturer. And so we certainly know what some of them are getting. And then there and there's also a number of student. There seems to be a policy of every couple of years they take on a student archaeologist who gets trained, I think possibly at the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem, and then gets a position as a deputy and then a full rank regional inspector. And they're always Palestinian. And there's 3 or 4 of those. Auni Dejani, Dimitri Baramchi, Mahuli is the first of those, and Slim Abdeslam al-Husseini, and I think there's one more who I might have forgotten, but I'm not sure. Amara Thornton has done more work on that kind of side of things, and the sort of more kind of like proper archaeologists level of employment. When it comes to people like Masri, we only see their rates of pay because of the preservation of these sort of internal letters, like the ones around the figures that I've mentioned today. So there's a couple of guys at Jericho whose records are still there. There's somebody at Akka whose records are still in there. There are the various people that I've mentioned at Leet. And those rates in the 20s, they started about £2.50 a month. By the time Al-Masri is fired in 1941, he's on £5 a month. And there's gradations within that. They seem to try and start people off as low as possible. And if they stay for a long time and they do a good job, then there is scope, if they keep asking, to have their pay raised. Al-Masri does say on a couple of occasions, I should be on increments. I'm a public public servant here? Why am I not on increments? And they never really answer that. But he does go up from just under £4 a month when he starts in 1930 up to £5 a month in 1941. And they do, when these are going on, so it's all quite ad hoc what they're being paid. And it does seem to partly be down to how much the individual is willing to ask and willing to push. And they also seem to take factors like size of family into account. So in Jericho, they employ several kind of quite young single men, and they're all started off on much lower rates, and they never get any higher because most of them leave quite quickly. One of them goes and joins the Palestine police instead. So we're very much looking in single figures for these manual labourers, and we're looking at, certainly for the sort of, as far as I can remember, for the sort of the grade at which you might get a younger British person or a well-educated Palestinian or a Jewish employee, you're looking at maybe sort of £20 or £30. So that's the kind of comparison you'd be talking about.
Thank you. A similar question, shifting now to the description of work duties. Is it similarly sort of ad hoc, where you were able to interpret work duties, for example, of al-Masri based on just this array of documents that you had at your disposal, or are there specific documents that you've encountered in the archive that outline particular job duties for different categories of workers?
So with somebody like Abdullah al-Masri, it was very much a process of just finding mentions in these letters of what it is that he's doing. He's a guard, you know, the main part of it is made pretty clear. But things like the building, the weeding, the mending pots and things, that's stuff that just is mentioned very scattered throughout the letters. So that kind of very much comes from all over the place. And it's sort of, it kind of, certainly when you compare him with the Jericho men that I was talking about, it sort of, to at least some extent, seems to be that kind of situation of the job's almost what they make it. So he could have just sat there with the gun on his knee outside the British house, guarded the site and done nothing else. But he obviously was just probably bored out of his skull if he tried to do that, and wanted to make sort of, you know, he seems to be sort of quite ambitious in the sense of wanting to be paid more, wanting to move to Jerusalem, wanting to, you know, he emphasizes that he does more stuff. He does this good work with the ceramics, and John says he's an expert. He calls him an expert pot mender. You know, that he acquires these other skills. You know, he does want to go beyond just sitting there with the gun on his knee guarding the site, whereas the guys in Jericho seem to be young men who are just after a paid job, and see it as a sort of entry point into civil service employment or something like that. Or there's one who leaves because he's too busy with his own stuff. So it seems to be that the low rates that they're paying are maybe subsidized by the fact that they assume that these guys have got a bit of land or some family work that they can do on top of it. So at this sort of level, it very much seems that, you know, there's a job title which tells you what the basic thing is: guard, night watchman, museum attendant, and then there is scope to build on that. Obviously, at the sort of more senior level, there are things like job advertisements and contracts that say these are your jobs. It's something that's much more recognizable to us in this day and age as, you know, an HR relationship, a personnel relationship of employer and employee, and a contractual kind of engagement.
Thank you. So YouTube question coming in from Jeffrey Zorn. Are there any dig diaries from C.N. Johns that reference the individuals that you have researched?
I was at the Palestine Exploration Fund a couple of weeks ago, and I wanted to look at them then and didn't. There was a whole load of stuff that I needed to look at, and I only got to look at some of it. because disorganization and stuff. So that's a kind of future part of the project, is to get back down to London and look at John's material. But I think Felicity might well have a bit more to say on that.
Yes, yes, we've got a lot of the John stuff. There's also a lot in the archives of the Israel Antiquities Authority, so it's kind of like sometimes there's quite a lot of duplication. But we have a lot of personal correspondence as well, which is very interesting. And yes, quite a lot of the kind of archaeological material from Atlit, but also other sites he worked on, Ajloun and the Citadel in Jerusalem.
But things like dig diaries, they've because I've sort of worked on a few other figures like this, principally a couple of guys who worked for the Palestine Exploration Fund in the 1890s and early 1900s, and things like dig diaries are very, very variable in terms of how much individual names and individual figures turn up. Some people, like Frederick Jones Bliss, he's really interested in his workers. He talks a lot about them. They're an amazing ethnographic resource. Other people hardly mention anything. So it's very, very variable. But there's archives, at the Israeli Antiquities Authority, at the Palestine Exploration Fund. If there's anyone out there looking for a project, the Sebastia Samaria archive from 1908, 9, 10 that's at the Harvard Semitic Museum is gold. There is some amazing material in there, including complete pay lists of all of its staff. So that's men and women who are being employed there, and every name of everybody who is paid, which is more comprehensive than anything I've seen anywhere else. There's also stuff in things like the diaries and the sort of site write-ups and things, but those pay lists are incredible. And what's particularly interesting is that after the first couple of weeks on the dig, most of them are in Arabic. So whoever is running, and it's beautifully written Arabic, so whoever is handling the pay, whether it's one of the Egyptians that have been brought up as a foreman, so a kufti, or whether it's somebody local who is, not just literate, but has got beautiful handwriting, who is acting as a sort of clerk, but for social history of the village of Sebastia and the area around there, that archive is just sitting there waiting, going, there's at least a PhD here.
Yeah. I should also mention that C.N. Johns has beautiful handwriting, so it's a joy to go through his stuff.
Yeah, it always makes a difference, doesn't it, when looking through archives? You really appreciate the good handwriting, or typewritten letters.
Yeah, I mean, there's stuff that I've gotten recently from the National Archive that looks like somebody's gotten a spider, dunked it in some ink and just traced it across the page. Allegedly, it's writing.
That's most of what we have is like that, but C.N. Johns stands out as a paragon of handwriting virtue.
So I think we will start to wrap it up now that we're 10 after the hour here. And I will ask the final question, which also came in from the YouTube audience. And has there been research conducted either by you or others on the descendants of the individuals that you have researched?
In terms of me, I've started doing that a little bit. So I had been trying to do it on one of the people that I was talking about from the Palestine Exploration Fund archives, who worked in the Ottoman period, but he vanishes in the early 20s. And I think he probably goes back home to Lebanon. And I haven't managed to trace him beyond about the early 20s. And that is the bane of my life at the moment. In terms of Abdullah al-Masri, so he vanishes from this archive when he is fired in 1941, or when he finishes working for them in 1941. However, okay, so his wife, during all of this time, and the place where he keeps vanishing off to, is a village called Tantura. And for people who are familiar with Mandate Palestinian Authority history, Tantura is the site of a probable massacre by the Haganah's Androni Brigade in 1948. It's difficult to know how many Palestinians were killed in that, but there was a big controversy over the research that was done about it at Haifa University about, God, it's probably going on 20 years now. But there are, it looks from various sort of lists and information about the village that al-Masri was quite a common name in the village, that it's probably, his family are there. I don't know what happened to Abdullah. I do know that other Masris from Tantura were killed in that massacre. Others turn up in oral history projects that were done in the 70s and 80s and 90s in refugee camps in Syria and Lebanon. So I've not been able to trace direct descendants of Abdullah al-Masri because I don't know his kids' names. But certainly in terms of his extended family from the village of Tantura, a lot of it is at the violent end of what happens to Palestinians in the war of 1948, that a lot of them are either murdered or they become refugees. I do know of other people who are doing that kind of research. There is, I believe, a group of people who have been trying to investigate, and I think have been interviewing even villagers from some of the places where Dorothy Garrod dug. And I think have been trying to track direct descendants. I know that that's something that you're trying to do maybe with Tel Anaspe. I don't think I know of any others, but it's definitely sort of something that is kind of on the edge of my mind as something I want to try and do in the future. And I know that it's kind of something that other people are sort of interested in thinking about. There are resources that are useful for that. And I think the Palestine Museum, the new Palestine Museum in the West Bank near Ramallah is I suspect going to be very valuable for that sort of thing, because it is doing a lot of crowdsourcing of family materials and family history. There's also this website, Palestine Remembered, where individual Palestinians from all over the world comment on their village's history. So you get like bits of people talking about their family and stuff like that. But obviously, because of the dispersion of 2/3 of the Palestinian population at the time are dispersed as refugees in 1948 and end up in refugee camps and beyond all over the world. So it's a particularly challenging area to be trying to do that for.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's certainly a very complicated topic, but that was an incredibly useful answer. So thank you once again for this excellent talk, very illuminating question and answer session too. And I'm going to hand it over to Aaron to say a few words to conclude.
Right. Yeah, I just want to wrap things up by, of course, thanking today's speaker, Sarah Irving, for a fascinating session, both in terms of the presentation and the questions and answers. Really made for a fine learning experience. And for our audience out there, just a reminder that the next talk in our series will be happening on December 2nd at 9 a.m. California time. So log in through the YouTube channel. And that's when Jeffrey Zorm of Cornell University will be presenting on the career of Labib Sorial. So we look forward to that. And I also want to thank our various co-sponsors, of course, Bade Museum staff for making this possible, the Palestine Exploration Fund and the Archaeological Research Facility at UC Berkeley. So thanks to everyone.